Okay, so like Catherine said, going to be doing a little crash course on IPA today. I'm going to do an intro and talk about consonants today, and then next week we're going to talk about vowels. And all of the materials that I show you, I will send them to Catherine so that she can put them up in the Dropbox or wherever so that you can see them. But basically, the goal today is to just give you a little familiarity with kind of the terms that we use to talk about sounds in IPA so that you can then look at an IPA chart and know, based on the labels, what kind of sound that symbol actually represents. And then if you want to get familiar with them and actually use them to notate pronunciations in your music, it's a lot easier because it gives you a consistent way to reference different types of sounds. So anytime we are talking about language, which when we're singing, that involves language, we have to deal with sounds. And unfortunately, the way that words are spelled, as I'm sure you all know, depending on the language, it might not actually have any relation at all to what the sounds actually are in how you pronounce the word. So relying on how words are actually spelled doesn't always tell us how they should be pronounced, which obviously if you're trying to sing the word, you want to know how it should be pronounced. There's also tons of different scripts and writing systems around the world. So the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is what we're going to be talking about today and next week, was developed so that we have a way to refer to any sound based on how that sound is made, so the characteristics of that actual sound, and then we have a symbol to represent that sound outside of any specific language or writing system. So that's why it's called the International Phonetic Alphabet. You can use these symbols to represent any sound in any language just based on how is that sound actually made. So there's three main characteristics that we use to talk about sounds or identify sounds, and those are voicing, place of articulation, and manner of articulation. And that's mainly what we're going to talk about today. So voicing just refers to what your vocal folds are doing when you make that sound. Are they vibrating, in which case we call that a voiced sound, or are they not vibrating, in which case we call that a voiceless sound. This is entirely review for Chloe and Andrew because they're currently taking the phonetics class, but yes, hopefully it's still fun for you. So, for example, an S sound, if you put your hand here, you don't feel any vibration. If you make a Z or a Z sound, Z, your tongue and your mouth is in the exact same position. The only difference is that now your vocal folds are vibrating. So S is a voiceless sound, no vibration. Z, that's a voiced sound, there's vibration. That's pretty easy. You can usually figure out by touching your own throat whether or not a sound is voiced or voiceless. Now, place of articulation and manner of articulation, those are probably new terms to you. Place of articulation just refers to which parts of your vocal tract are involved in shaping that particular sound. So we call those the articulators for that sound. So which things are involved? Which part of your tongue is involved? Which part of your mouth is it touching or near to? Are your lips involved? Those sorts of things. That's what we mean when we talk about place of articulation. And then manner of articulation refers to how are those articulators actually shaping the sound. And generally, that's going to be on a scale from more constriction to less constriction, with vowels obviously being the least constricted of any sound. Hold on, lost my place in my notes. So we're going to go over what the different places of articulation and the different manners of articulation are. And that will help you understand the name of most consonants that you might want to talk about. And it'll also help you understand how the IPA chart is set up. So this is the International Phonetic Alphabet. I'm going to zoom in a bit. You may want to have your Zoom in speaker view, or actually, yeah, okay. Or just pin my video so that this is larger for you so you can see it. So this is the official IPA chart. And you'll notice that there's a bunch of symbols in here, and there's labels across the top and labels down the side. Now, the labels across the top, those are going to be your places of articulation that we're going to talk about first. And down the side, those are going to be the manners of articulation. So let's talk about place of articulation and what are all the different ways that your articulators can come together to make different sounds. So these are the articulators that are involved. There's some things that are labeled on here that are not actually articulators, but that's okay. And on the IPA chart and in general, when we talk about places of articulation, we always start by talking about the ones at the front of the mouth working all the way back through the vocal tract. And that's how the symbols on the IPA chart are organized. So the very first place of articulation is called bilabial. And these are sounds that involve both of your lips. So like p or b or m. Those sounds are made by your lips coming together. Those are the articulators involved. So we call those bilabial sounds. Then moving backwards, the next type of sound you have. Now, just to clarify, I'm not going to cover every single place of articulation that could possibly exist, but I'm going to cover the main ones that you might hear talked about. So moving backwards, if you have your lower lip touching your upper teeth, that is a labiodental sound. So like f or v, the F and V sounds that we have in English, those are labiodental. They involve your lips touching your teeth. Then if you have your tongue tip in between your teeth, like for th or the, that's an interdental sound. So if you look on your, now the official IPA chart does not have as much detail as is helpful. So I will also be sending Catherine for you to look at the expanded IPA chart. This is what they use in the phonetics class, has lots more symbols on it and all of the information. So just know that some of the things we talked about might not necessarily be represented. You'll see we just have dental here. We don't have interdental, and they've included, these are actually the symbols for the th and the sounds, and they're just included under the category of dental because they involve your teeth, when technically they're interdental because they involve your tongue going in between your teeth. Dental just means that your tongue is right up behind your teeth. So if you are a Spanish speaker or someone who's learned Spanish and has a good accent, a lot of the consonants in Spanish are dental. So they sound a little bit different. They sound a little bit more forward than, say, how we would make them in English. So like ta, da, things like that, where your tongue tip is right up behind your teeth. That would be a dental place of articulation. Then we have things that involve your alveolar ridge. So behind your teeth, you'll feel you have a nice ridge there before you move back into the hard palate area. That's called your alveolar ridge. And a lot of sounds are made with your tongue tip touching your alveolar ridge. So for example, t, d, s, z, n, l, all of those sounds are made with your tongue tip touching your alveolar ridge, so we would call those alveolar sounds. They are at an alveolar place of articulation. It's a very common place of articulation in lots of languages. Then you have palatoalveolar, or it's sometimes called post-alveolar. So in the official IPA chart It's called postalveolar, but palatoalveolar is actually the more common way that you might see it referred to, but those mean the same thing. So this is some of the sounds we were just talking about, the sh sound, what we use an SH to represent in English. That is a palatoalveolar sound. And what that means is what we call the tongue blade, so the part that's right behind the tongue tip, but not quite in the middle of the tongue, that gets up close to the area that's right behind your alveolar ridge. So when you make sh or zh, those sounds we have in English. There's other sounds you can make there, but those are the most common ones. Those are palatoalveolar or postalveolar sounds. Then we've got palatal. So you all know where your hard palate is. That's something, hard palate, soft palate, that's something we talk about in singing. So when the center of your tongue gets up near your hard palate, those are palatal sounds. So one sound that we have in English that's palatal is y. The J glide, the y sound, sometimes represented with a Y, that is a palatal sound. The constriction is happening with the center of your tongue coming up towards your hard palate. Also, the ñ in Spanish or the GN in Italian, that sound we were just talking about in veni veni, that is spelled with a GN, that is also a palatal sound. It's just a nasal, so it's a ñ sound, but it's still made with the center of your tongue touching your hard palate. Moving backwards to your soft palate, which we call the velum. It's another name for the soft palate. That's the part that moves to either open or block off your nasal cavity. So when you hum, your velum is open. When you say a lot of other sounds, like when you do a vowel sound, your velum is generally closed. But your tongue can touch or come near your velum, and we call those velar sounds. So k and g, also ng, that we use ng to represent in English, those are all velar sounds. Then you have uvular. So your uvula is the little flap that hangs down in the back of your mouth. And so when you have your tongue touching or near your uvula, those are uvular sounds. We don't really have any uvular sounds in English, but in a lot of the Salish languages, which are indigenous to this area of BC, you have lots of uvular sounds. So you might have k or ng. In French, the French R is actually a uvular sound. So the r sound, it's trill and or fricative. It's hard to control the actual movement of the uvula, so you don't always have control over how much it's moving, but that is a uvular sound. Then moving even further back, we have pharyngeal. So this is where the tongue root, so way back there in your tongue, gets close to your pharyngeal wall, so the back of your throat. You also have epiglottal, which is where you're constricting even further down. And in a lot of languages, there's not really a difference between pharyngeal or epiglottal. They're so far back in your throat that it's hard to differentiate between them. But pharyngeal and or epiglottal sounds you'll often hear in languages like Arabic, like the ra, ra down there, that sound. It was also originally in Hebrew, although I think modern Hebrew doesn't as much use pharyngeals. So any of those sounds that sound like they're way far down there, that's probably a pharyngeal or an epiglottal sound. And then finally we have glottal, and these are sounds that directly involve your vocal folds or your glottis. So for example, a glottal stop, which we do use in singing. So the whenever you start a word with a vowel in English, you actually start it with a glottal stop if there's nothing else that's coming before it. Also, H, the H sound, that's also considered glottal because it doesn't really have any other articulators. So when we talk about glottal sounds, we're kind of saying either the actual glottis is closed, like for a glottal stop, or just kind of your whole vocal tract is the place of articulation, or the articulators, I mean, for H, because there's no real constriction going on when you're making an H sound. So those are all kind of the major places of articulation, and you'll notice if you look at your IPA chart, they're arranged exactly in that order, from the front of the mouth all the way back to the glottis. One we didn't talk about is retroflex, and this one is, again, not really in English, but in a lot of Indian languages you may have heard these types of sounds. And this is where your tongue kind of curls behind your alveolar ridge. So da, da. It's a very particular sound that you'll probably recognize if you know people that are from India and originally speak languages from there. Those sounds are very common. Any questions about places of articulation before we look at manners? Like I said, this is really just a crash course so that you understand the labels that are used in the IPA chart, and that way, if you can figure out how you're making a particular sound, you can identify what the labels are, and you can find a symbol to represent that sound. You obviously can't just like sit down and memorize all of these symbols in a day, but this will give you the tools you need to kind of navigate this chart and start using these symbols if you want to. Did I miss any questions? Okay, awesome. Let's talk about manners of articulation. So places of articulation, what I talked about pretty much lines up exactly with what's on the IPA chart, and that's the order that you will always see people refer to manners of articulation. They'll always start at the front of the mouth and work to the back of the mouth. For manners of articulation, there's much more variation in how you'll see them arranged. So I'm actually going to talk about them in a different order than what is on the official IPA chart. So let me get that one. So I'm going to talk about them. I'm also going to use a slightly different terminology. Mainly what is referred to as plosives on the IPA chart, I will be calling stops. Those are the same thing. They're just two different terms. Anyone who's strictly talking about phonetics will probably use the term plosive. The class that I teach is called phonology, and primarily we talk about stops. So depending on what kind of background the person who's talking about it is, you might hear plosive or you might hear stops, but they mean the same thing. Now, the reason why I have these manners of articulation ordered in this way is because it basically goes from most constriction of the airflow to least constriction of the airflow. The IPA chart is arranged slightly differently for different reasons, but I find that this is the most helpful way to remember what types of sounds we're talking about. So stops are sounds where you have a complete stoppage of airflow. So like p or b, right? Before you actually get to making the sound, the air is completely stopped. Your lips are closed, there's no air coming through. That is called a stop or a plosive. So in English, we have a number of stops. Every language has stops. It's one of the kind of universal categories of sounds. But in English, we have p and b, which are the bilabial ones. Oh, one convention that's good to know. When there are sounds in the same box, the first one is always the voiceless one, and the second one is always the voiced. So depending on which side of the box it's on, you can tell whether it's voiced or voiceless. So all these sounds are voiced, and these ones are voiceless. So p, voiceless, b, voiced. And we also have alveolar ones, that's t and d. And we have velar ones, that's k and g. We've also got our glottal stop, complete stoppage of airflow when you make a glottal stop. So that's the manner of articulation for glottal stop. We're going to talk about fricatives first and then come back to affricates. So fricatives are sounds where you have not a complete stoppage of airflow, but you have a lot of constriction. So like s, z, sh, zh, f, v. Right? The airflow is not completely stopped, but your articulators are pretty close together, so there's a lot of constriction. They sound very kind of turbulent. There's a lot of frication, which is where fricative comes from. So in English, we have a whole bunch of fricatives. Now, we don't have bilabial ones, but there are languages that have bilabial fricatives, so f and v. But we have labiodental, so f and v. We have the interdental ones, so th and the th sound. We actually have both the voiceless and the voiced version in English. We just write them the same way. We have alveolar ones, s and z. And we have palatal alveolar ones, so the sh sound, the sh sound, which Catherine was referring to as the squiggle. Looks like that. So it's kind of like just a tall, stretched out S. This is a really handy symbol because it shows up everywhere. And you can, if you want to talk about it, you can refer to it as an esh. That's often how it's referred to. And the voiced version of that is zh, which we do actually have in English, although it's not very common because it's mostly in borrowed words. Then other fricatives that you might be used to from languages that we often sing, like German, you can have velar fricatives. So if you make a K sound, k, and then you just let more air through, that's a velar fricative. That comes up in German. So that's the voiceless one. You can also have the voiced one. These also are in Spanish, in lots of languages. The palatal fricative is what you might have heard referred to as like the cat hissing sound. So that also shows up in German. And then there's also the voiced version of that, which I always get mixed up. Yeah, okay, it's this one. Weird J with a line through it. And then I mentioned in French, the French R is a uvular fricative or trill. It's hard to control, but the roi, whatever, that word that's really hard to say in French, that is a uvular fricative. I believe the French one is voiced. The French R is the voiced one, but I'm not 100% sure. So the voiceless one looks like is like the chi. You'll notice that there's a lot of Greek symbols in here and a lot of Latin script as well. And then the voiced version of the uvular fricative is the upside down small capital R, which I find very hard to draw. But I believe this one is the French R, the voiced uvular fricative. Now, an affricate is just a combination of a stop and a fricative. So the CH sound in English is ch. That's a combination of a T and an esh. So this is exactly what we were discussing in should it be nas chetur or na shetur. That's the difference between an affricate that has a complete stoppage of sound and then a fricative, or just a fricative. The voiced version of that is the j sound. So something that we might refer to as a hard, well, No, that's usually in English, that I think that would be called a soft G, the J sound. So that is a D followed by a J. But they're just kind of smushed together so that they're really pronounced at the same time. So ch and J. Those are the most common affricates. There's a lot of other affricates, but those are the ones you'll see most frequently. You'll often also see affricates represented with a little, what we call a tie bar above them to show that they're actually a single sound. You're using two symbols to represent them, but they're really one sound. So then we have nasals. Now, nasals involve, in one sense, a complete stoppage of air because there's no air coming through your mouth, but that's because all the air is coming through your nasal cavity. So, all of those sounds, those are all called nasals because the air is coming through your nasal cavity. So we have the bilabial nasal, have the alveolar, which is the velar, we use the NG to represent that in English. We do have that. So whenever you have a word that ends in ing, there's actually no G. There's no actual G sound in that. It's just this nasal. Then other common ones would be the palatal nasal, ng. Those are really the most common. You can also have a uvular nasal, ng. That one's fun. But bilabial, alveolar, velar, and then palatal, those are the ones you'll see most frequently. Laterals are when you have air escaping out the sides of your tongue. So an L, your tongue is touching your alveolar ridge, so it's an alveolar place of articulation, but the air is actually coming around the sides of your tongue because those aren't touching. So any sound that involves air coming around the sides of your tongue, we call a lateral. The most common one is L. And that shows up in lots of languages. But you can also have lateral fricatives and lateral affricates. L is technically a lateral approximant, which you'll see we have approximants down here because it involves very little constriction of the air besides just directing it to come around the sides of your tongue. If you were to tighten up those spaces a little bit, you would get a lateral fricative, which is a sound, or z. And then you can also have lateral affricates, which is where you get a T combined with the lateral fricative, so cha or ja, a T or a D depending on if it's voiced or voiceless. I don't have rows for lateral fricatives, but you'll notice in your official IPA chart it does. So those are the symbols for the voiced and voiceless lateral fricatives. You won't see affricates in the official IPA chart. They have just a note that affricates are written with tie bars and double articulations, but so they don't actually have that row. I don't have a lateral fricative row or lateral approximant rows. So everybody does it a little bit differently. But you'll notice here in the official IPA chart, we also have like a retroflex lateral approximant and a palatal one and a velar one. So those will show up in different languages. And the palatal one, if any of you have ever learned Italian, that is the really difficult to say GL sound. Yeah. Yeah. That's what that is. That's why it's really hard to say, not a sound we have in English. Palatal is not a place of articulation we use a lot in English, so that's what that one is. That's why I wished I had taken phonetics before I tried to learn Italian. Okay, flaps and taps. These are generally going to be alveolar. That's the most common ones. And this is what you might have heard referred to as a flipped R. So a flap or a tap is where you have your tongue just flapping or tapping once to wherever it's going. So the flipped R, that is just your tongue flapping to your alveolar ridge. And the difference between a flap and a tap is generally which direction your tongue is going. So if your tongue is kind of going front to back, I believe that's a tap, and a flap is kind of back to front. But don't quote me on that. They're generally equivalent. You're never going to have a distinction between a flap or a tap in a single language. It'll just be like most people do it this way or most people do it that way, and that'll be whether it's a flap or a tap. This is usually a flap. I think that's the most common one. So that is the symbol for it, if you want to use that to represent the flipped R. Trills are where you have, so flaps and taps is where you have a single kind of flip of the articulator. Trills is where you have a bunch of them all in a row. So the difference between a flipped R and a trilled R is just how many flaps your tongue is doing, right? So the trilled R is alveolar, and we use the regular R symbol to represent it. So r, that would be a trill R. Also, the bilabial trill, which we do as a warm-up, that is a sound that actually exists in languages and is used to make words. And so there's a symbol for it. So that is a small capital B. So that's actually a sound, not just a warm-up. And then the uvular trill also comes up sometimes. Again, I said when you're making uvular sounds, it's hard to distinguish, to intentionally do a fricative versus a trill. So a French R, depending on the speaker, you might have some people making it a fricative and some people making it a trill. And the symbol for that is just the right side up, small capital 1, whereas the fricative is the upside down one. Now, approximants and glides are very similar. We make a distinction between them in the class that I teach because it's important, but really they're generally the same thing. There's very little constriction going on in your mouth. So the y sound, the J glide, which we've already talked about, that's palatal. We represent it with a J in the IPA. That is, so I put that in approximants, it's actually a glide. The reason why we call some things glides is because they have a relation to particular vowels, and so we use glides as the term for those specific approximants, but they are all in the general category of approximants. Also, the English R, the R sound, that is an approximant. There's very little constriction going on. Your articulators are moving closer together, but they're not really constricting the air very much. And we represent that with an upside down R. The other common glide is the W sound, which is represented with a W. And that is actually technically a double articulation. You use your lips, but also the back of your tongue is going up towards your velum. So it's using the bilabial place of articulation and also the velar place of articulation. So sometimes we just put it in both categories, or we make a separate column and say labiovelar. Sorry guys, went a little late. But that's the crash course in consonants. And like I said, I'm going to send all of these things to Catherine, and she'll post them so that you can go and look at them. And next week, we will go over vowels.
Thank you, Hannah. It was so